Hello. So this uh, recording has a rather long title, but basically what I'm talking about here is developing codes for qualitative data and then organising them into themes. So what we're doing when we code qualitative data, as that first bullet point says there, is we're forming tentative categories which describe the data. So basically codes are very short labels that we give to a piece of data. So you might have several lines of text and you think that this is a bit of text which is talking about people's green consumption, say. So that would be your short code for that bit of data. And the codes can be based on all sorts of things, but they can be sometimes the exact words used by participants. So for instance, we had a code which was called people's must-do list, because people started talking in some tourism research about having a must-do list when they were on holiday in a particular destination. So we used that exact word. And then you sometimes have a priori codes, and these are codes that you're expecting to find based on your preliminary research by looking at the literature. And then emergent codes are ideas that emerge from the data, so things that you perhaps weren't expecting but come out are quite interesting. So that code we had for the must-do list, that came out from our data. It wasn't something we expected to find there. And then you can group codes on a common idea into broader themes, and again I'll show you some examples of that. So students often struggle to identify codes, and you can begin to think about your codes throughout your dissertation. So even as you're writing a literature, you can start thinking, okay, I would expect to have some of these kinds of things come up in my data. Even when you're drafting your interview schedule, because obviously you're asking questions on things and you'll be expecting people to talk about certain things. When you write up field notes, that's an obvious thing. You've just done an interview and you might want to jot down some notes about what that interview told you. When you're transcribing interviews, or right at the end when you sit down to do some analysis. But generally I would start, I mentioned before, having my little research notebook. I often keep notes on things like this. So when we start encoding, just to kind of get you started off, there's some very broad categories you can use here. One, we've got attribute coding, and this is just basic descriptive information, maybe about the person who was interviewed, so possibly their participant characteristics, the nature of the focus group, that kind of thing. So these are very sort of broad level. Holistic coding, this is, a basic theme or issue that comes up, so I don't know, for instance, green energy use might be something that I might look at. You might have provisional coding from your objectives, your literature review, your data collection, and also a great code for writing up. So that was our must-do list, that jumped out at us. And if you look at the textbooks, so I've got an example here, and it sometimes helps, because students sometimes say to me, I don't understand what a code is. Well, have a read around it a bit more. But there's some examples here. So descriptive coding, identifies the topic. Okay, so so for instance, green energy is a descriptive code. It doesn't say anything about that. It just sort of says that bit of text refers to green energy. A process coding, doing words, activities or actions. So that might be to do with something that they're taking part in. What activities that are happening there. Emotional coding. And sometimes this is inferred by the researcher, but it could actually be that people talk about particular emotions. They might talk about being particularly excited, in terms of their sport participation. Values coding, reflecting participants' values, attitudes or beliefs. So for instance, in the kind of research I do, people might sort of tell me they're particularly concerned about climate change. I try to avoid using the car. That's to do with their values. Versus coding is a binary conflict, so you might get people who are positioned on one side of an issue and another. Evaluation coding, these are judgments about the worth of something or someone. So people in a focus group have started dismissing a particular concept, for instance. And in vivo coding, this is where you use some of the participants' language, like in the must-do lists that we created. And magnitude coding indicates frequency, direction, intensity. So, I might sort of make a note that a participant was, particularly concerned about this issue, kept emphasising it. Okay. There are various analytical tools you can use to do this. So, for instance, there is what's called CAGDAS, Computer-Aided Qualitative Data Analysis Software. We actually have access to NVivo at Bournemouth University. I don't use it myself, but I would only recommend in a dissertation that you take the time to use it if you already know how to use it, or if you have got a lot of qualitative data, because it does take time to learn. I would recommend one of the other things that I've said there, colour highlighting in Word, which you can do on the screen, creating columns or tables in Word, and then you can make notes next to your text. And actually, I find nowadays I use the comments format in Word. But there's other kind of ways that we can do where we can kind of cut and paste material, or even cut up paper sections of interviews and put data together. So I've got an example here of colour highlighting in Word. So here, various bits of text have been pulled out with a different colour that reflects a different code. Okay, so there's 3 different codes that have come up here. So for instance, the first one in green is about, cycling being eco-friendly. The bits in red are to do with, the energy intensity of the activity, in terms of you putting bikes in cars, and they even say that any leisure pursuit uses up energy. And then the yellow bits are to do with their leisure motivations. Okay, so this is to do with people's cycling as a leisure activity. Now I've got the same kind of thing, this is the same bit of data but using columns and tables in words. And as I say, one of the things I do now is, rather than doing this, I actually use the comment function in Word documents and write it on as a comment at the side, because also then you can easily highlight the text. So that's my preferred way of doing it. Anyway, and I will tend to go through my data initially writing memos like this. So remember, memo writing is an earlier stage of coding, and then begin to more formally put those into some codes. Okay, so once you've gone through that process, you need to kind of do some sort of data reduction, which is about selecting, focusing, the data down. So you code the data, you select some data. Remaining data discarded, I wouldn't discard it, but what I often do, so if I go back to here where I've identified and coded some data, I might pull out and put into another Word document all the data that refers to cycling as green. Okay, I'll make sure I've got a participant code linked to that data, but I might start a new file which is called cycling is green, which is all my data that relates to that. And it's a bit of an iterative process, and often I find that once I've done a whole load of data coding, I've used slightly different terms, so I actually review my list of codes and kind of go, okay, I've talked about cycling being green, I've talked about it being environmentally friendly, they're both about the same thing, so I put them together. And then we've got an example here of where codes have been grouped into themes. So what I'm going to do is, in one of the face-to-face sessions, I will show you one of my journal articles, and this is actually from that journal article. And we wrote this up in, well, there was actually 3 themes, but I've only shown 2 here on this slide. And these were the codes that fitted into the themes. So the codes are down the left-hand side, the long list, and then the theme that they went into is on the right-hand side, so they were grouped into those themes. So our first theme was on time fluidity, and you can see there that, the codes were flexible and fluid approach to plans. Must-do lists, remember I talked about that, but go with the flow. So this was to do with people sort of writing down a list of things that they thought they wanted to do when they were on holiday, but actually then choosing to go with the flow. And then there was things to do with their experience of time, present time, being in the present, as a tourist, and then place rhythms. And we put those all into time fluidity. And then you can see similarly under control of time, we grouped a number of things to do with things like time constraints, that people experienced. And then we wrote up the data according to those themes. So in our findings section, we had a heading. The first one was time fluidity, the second one was control of time, and that's how we wrote up the data. Okay, and I will cover more on writing up qualitative research in a later recording.